Okay, we'll start. This morning we have essentially three parts to it. We have the feedback from yesterday and agreeing the ballot paper. That's, if you like, the first substantive piece of work. Secondly, much looked forward to a presentation from some of our colleagues from, let's call it, the AWEPA delegation. And then later on, we get to the voting, and we have an important item at the end at 12 o'clock where we inform you about and have a short discussion about the remaining issues on the any other amendments list, and we'll provide the context for that discussion when we get to that point in the agenda. But to kick off, we're going to have the feedback from the final discussion, roundtable discussion yesterday, and David is going to provide you with that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So the feedback from the discussions yesterday afternoon, and you remember this is where we sort of brought together everything you've been discussing all day long. So some of the items that you'll see were on previous feedback sessions yesterday, and the ballot paper that you're about to see in a minute very closely reflects these slides that I'm going to talk you through quickly. So the feedback seems to be grouped into four main areas. First of all, relating to the Office of the Ceann Comhairle. So various suggestions about, again, whether the Ceann Comhairle should be elected by a secret ballot of the members, that perhaps the Ceann Comhairle, having been elected then, would have greater control, might be chairing some kind of committee that would have control over the Dáil agenda, including over issues about the use of guillotines and such. Whether the Office of the Ceann Comhairle should be somehow codified in the Constitution. Obviously, the Ceann Comhairle is already mentioned in the Constitution, but there were specific proposals from the table about whether that should be strengthened in the Constitution itself, and we'll come to that in a minute. So there are a number of themes relating to the Office of the Ceann Comhairle. And then on the whip, once again, a lot of proposals relating to how the whip might be relaxed, or greater scope at least for free votes for TDs to abstain, particularly on issues of conscience. Then we have a whole series. Committees seem to feature an awful lot in the feedback here again. A lot of proposals relating to the Dáil committees, Oireachtas committees perhaps more generally. So the committee should have additional personnel and resources, that the chairs of the committees should be elected. There is already a proposal about how the allocation of committee chairs might be determined based on the size of the parties in the Dáil. The government is already bringing forward suggestions in that regard. But what we're getting in terms of the feedback from members here in the room is, once it's decided which party might control which committee chairs, should the committee chairs themselves then be elected by secret ballot of the members? That's what that is proposing. That TDs should be incentivised to take committee work more seriously, so that committees, the role of TDs on committees should be seen more as a privilege to Dáil deputies who are sitting on committees, rather than a right that all Dáil deputies get to sit on committees. That's a proposal from at least one table. Enhance the role of the committee that has been referred to so far as the liaison committee, using the British example, but as you'll see in a minute on the ballot paper, we're going to refer to it by its correct title, but this was the feedback from yesterday. So enhance the role of this liaison committee, including, like they do in Britain, the right for that committee to call a Taoiseach to attend a session and answer questions. Integrate former TDs as members of the Dáil Reform Committee, and also integrate outsiders as members of the Dáil Reform Committee. That the civil service should take more account of committee decisions, and a lot of suggestions relating to the idea of a committee week. And then finally, sort of other proposals that couldn't be grouped quite so readily. There was, from one table, a very explicit proposal that Article 17.2 should be amended. In a second, I'll give you the text of Article 17.2. That it should be amended to allow opposition to make proposals relating to spending of public monies. That there should be more time to debate the finance bill. So these two issues came up particularly after listening to John Bruton's panel presentation yesterday. And that the existing standing orders should be scrutinised to see if they're fit for purpose. That was an explicit proposal from one table. So here's the text of Article 17.2 that one table at least has proposed should be amended. So this would be an explicit proposal for a constitutional amendment by the Convention if you were to go ahead with this. So the text is, Dáil Éireann shall not pass any vote or resolution, and no law shall be enacted for the appropriation of revenue or other monies, unless the purpose of the appropriation shall have been recommended to Dáil Éireann by a message for the government signed by the Taoiseach. So this sets the restriction on the ability of the Dáil to discuss money bills unless there's been an explicit permission, as it were, given by the government. That's the issue at heart. But I guess now we're going to go straight into the ballot paper. Unless anyone has a view.
That should be other public monies there. It's monies from the public purse or the state finances, yeah.
Okay.
In the slide, yeah.
Yeah. Well, any quick views on this? But I mean, I suspect it may be more productive to go directly to the ballot paper, because we'll be doubling back, if you like, on that slide, because as David said, we tried to take account, in framing the ballot paper, we tried to take account of the matters that had been raised yesterday. And to take us, Art is going to take us through the ballot paper, because I think it's not only here is a set of questions, but I think there's an information context behind those questions, which I think is useful to set out while we're actually indicating the questions that you're going to vote on. Art.
Katrina.
Sorry, Katrina. Microphone, could we get the microphone over here?
Just a real question. It's not technically about the ballot paper, but just in September we had groups who were over, talking about citizens' representation, appropriate representation in the Dáil, and we were told that we'd be coming to that in the Dáil reform session. And I know it's probably not for the ballot paper today, but just a question, where are we going to deal with that? Because we gave a very strong commitment that, in fact, I remember raising it here at the floor, and I remember being told, no, that's going to be dealt with at Dáil reform. So it's appropriate representation for citizens who don't live in this state.
Could we could come to deal with that issue at the 12 o'clock session?
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. As you all know, this is my favourite part of the weekend, where you always take everything that I prepare to pieces. So thank you very much thank you very much in advance for that. I'm going to walk through the ballot paper. As you can see, it comes in 5 parts. I mean, the ballot paper is quite big, and for counting purposes, when we're done, we might split the ballot paper into 2. But let's agree the content first. So the first 4 questions are all about, it's not constitutional change. These are changes which could be implemented by changes to standing orders or to the way that the Dáil does its business or the way the political parties do their business as well. So we might walk through those. The first question is all about the role of the Ceann Comhairle, and I think there was significant opinion expressed yesterday about some changes about enhancing the role of the Ceann Comhairle, and a couple of the changes included, one is a secret ballot to elect the Ceann Comhairle. Now, there is a difference of opinion in relation to this, whether that can be done easily by a change to standing orders, but it may require constitutional change. But if you feel that that would be a good idea, I think we should make the recommendation and let the lawyers afterwards work out whether it requires a change in standing orders or a referendum. The second point here was to give the members of the Dáil themselves a greater input into the way that the agenda is set. Currently, the agenda is set by the government chief whip in consultation with the other whips of the other parties. They meet once a week, and Angus and Sean Friel and Catherine Murphy would attend these meetings. The government chief whip would bring proposals to the whips, and they would thrash out what the agenda looks like. I think it's fairly safe to say, Angus, that the government chief whip generally gets his own way in relation to these things, because the government have a very strong agenda. It's a very efficient way of doing business, like the way Mary spoke about yesterday, that the government says and then the Dáil simply follows the government agenda. What's proposed, or what was emerged from the discussion yesterday, was a transfer of some of that power from the government to set the agenda to the Dáil itself. So the Oireachtas members would create a forum, it's like a business committee chaired by the Ceann Comhairle, then, which would set the agenda, which would change the dynamic in how the Dáil sets its own business. Is that clear? I think there was some confusion yesterday in relation to how the agenda was set and what was proposed here. So what is the question is basically is you're taking away the power from the government to set the agenda to give members themselves a greater input, including the opposition parties. That's all that is. And Mary, you might like to say something about the implications of that particular change.
Well, the first two changes under the label of Ceann Comhairle, I think I would revisit some of the themes that I touched on yesterday in relation to the good and the bad, so to speak, for these proposals. A secret ballot to elect the Ceann Comhairle sounds very good in practice, but when you think about the logistics of how that would play itself out, it's quite possible that an opposition TD, of course, may win that secret ballot. And in the event that an opposition TD wins the ballot, it's likely they may be a little less government friendly in terms of how Dáil business is done. So there's a trade-off there. And it goes back to yesterday's argument about a stronger parliament has an effect on the strength of government. So it might make life a little bit more difficult for the executive. Not to suggest that that's necessarily a bad thing either, but to be aware that there is a consequence in terms of promoting this particular change. On the second point, members set the Dáil agenda in a forum chaired by the Ceann Comhairle. In that context, again, there's nothing inoffensive about that proposal, but if we're to think about the logistics of it, the only fear or reservation I might have is that that could be quite reactive. So it would be sort of further underlying the reactive character of the current institution that we have. When the members take control of the agenda, government business, again, may on occasion be sidelined. So it makes it difficult for the government to pursue its programme for government and to get business through the House. It might also be reactive to public opinion and the media in ways that may not necessarily always be constructive either. So I think that's a point to bear in mind. But absolutely, on the face of it, both there's nothing inoffensive about either of these proposals, but be aware that in making these choices, they will potentially have an impact on the balance of power between the executive and the parliament, and they may also potentially further underline the reactive character of the institution, and its reactive character is one of the things we criticise the institution for.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that first part? Robert and Francis. Well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Catherine. Robert heads first, and then you. After you, your second, Catherine, and then Francis. Yeah.
Robert Dowds. While in general I'm in favour of giving the members more power over the running of the, I mean, there are crisis situations where the government has to act, and we have had one in this since the last election where legislation had to be presented almost immediately, and there was a sort of an all-night sitting between the Dáil and Senate. The government must have control of that for the sake of the state. So there needs to be a mechanism to allow for that kind of situation. And I mean, while it doesn't happen very often, when it does happen, it is absolutely urgent.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Catherine?
I'm just wondering, the second part of the first question there, do you envisage that all of the power then is taken away and given to the Dáil as a whole rather than some of it in that? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, maybe take Francis as well, and Angus and Michelle.
Thank you. Art, it's just to tease out a little bit more what that actually means for the programme for government. So, if you have a programme for government, which you do, and you have legislation ready to go into the Dáil, and, sometimes the legislation isn't ready, or sometimes there's legislation that's ready before, the rest, there's going to have to be linkages between
Agreed.
The members setting the agenda and the government programme. So how is it envisaged, or how in other parliaments does that work? Because clearly there has to be a mechanism to link the two effectively and efficiently, because if it's all one way, then clearly that's not going to work. And it's quite stark the way it's put there. So just to tease that out a bit more.
Yeah,
certainly.
And from a basic accountability point of view, I mean, parties have put forward before an election a manifesto. which gets reflected in one way or another in a programme for government. So there is a basic accountability issue here as well. Michelle was first, actually, and then Angus. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it all goes back to what Professor Mary Murphy said yesterday, which is really the balance between the sustaining and the scrutiny. And I think Robert touched on what I probably had in mind, or what I have in mind to say, which is really, at different times, maybe we need that calibrated differently. And when we've had crisis like we've had, economic crisis for the past few years, we really need a more authoritarian type of government. We need decisions made. We can't be shilly-shallying about what's going to happen. The country being susceptible to, say, populism, etc., which ultimately can undermine our democracy and lead to anarchy. So I think at certain times there has to be that support, that unity. But when things move away from that, I think we can become more relaxed. And I think you gave maybe the formula for that, which is really focusing on committees and strengthening committees. And I think that the proposals there in relation to committees are good, resources, etc., so that we develop that sort of capacity and enjoy that side or develop that side, and that the country would enjoy the benefit of parliamentarians having the opportunity to actually examine policy, develop it, hear experts, etc. I would think that as a compromise, rather than the entire Parliament or the Dáil setting the agenda for the day, like it's accepted that everything is really government focused here, and that government control everything, and really you're talking really about the people who sit around the cabinet table, and then you're talking about probably 4 people at that. So it is very centralised at the moment. I think there's space there for the business of the Dáil, say, for a day, that after the government has its business set out, that the Parliament itself decides on other business for the day, so that it's not that all the Dáil has to decide, or that the Parliament itself has to decide on the business that the government needs to be doing, that there's a place for both in the day. And actually something I had mentioned yesterday was I just find it, I don't understand why we have order of business in the middle of the day. We should be having order of business in relation to what we're going to be doing for the rest of the day, and deciding it. If it's actually meaningful, we should be doing it at the beginning of the day. And just, I suppose, to say on committees, I think that a few of the benefits of having a pre-legislative process or job for committees where they examine in advance. Deputy Catherine Murphy mentioned the climate change bill, where you can actually go through what is a technical and complex area in advance, so that people know what way we're going to steer this, and we go forward with legislation. We had Deputy Buttimer talk about the Protection of Life and Pregnancy Bill, which prior to the heads of bill there was the consultation process, and I think that was very good. I think it was very forensic. I would actually like to say, though, I have one issue with it. At the end of the day, it only ever took account of 50% of the evidence given. There were medical and legal experts on both sides, and only 50% was given any credence to by government or responded to by government. So that's another issue, if we're reporting what response actually comes back from government. And I suppose just finally, I just didn't get a chance to say it yesterday, but I know that just from talking to people, the view that, say, in relation to clinics and the like, well, is this generated by TDs or what is it? I feel that the relationship between an elected person and constituents is very organic. And really, the clinics, all this sort of thing, which people will call clientelism, is a response to a demand that is there. It's what people are asking for. So probably the same people could sit around the table here and say, oh, we want our parliamentarians to be doing these lovely lofty things and figuring out, how we get world peace or things like that, but they want you to do this stuff besides. So maybe it's that's an anomaly. I would agree, though, it is very grounding, and I think it is very helpful, because at the end of the day, when you're elected by people, you're not an academic. We rely on academics and experts, and if we don't, we're being foolish as politicians. But if we don't feel the heart or the pulse or the beat of where people are at, then we won't be bringing people with us, and we can't have that dialogue which might allow us to show leadership on an issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have your point. Thanks, Michelle. Angus.
Margaret, just on the 2 points here in the Count Corla, I think that the first one, in terms of the secret ballot, should go under the constitutional one, because from the discussion on the table here, I think people believed that it should be done in secret. if we believe it should be done in secret, then why not put it into the constitution and set it out so that it can't be changed kind of willy-nilly each time there's a new government. The second point is in relation to how we order business, and I'm a whip for our party for 12 years, so I've attended quite a number of the ordering of business. And it is, as Art said, kind of we're presented with a document to say this is what the business is the following week, but it's not a fait accompli. And quite often, the whips from the other parties, because it's democratic, we discuss out, we can come up with practical reasons why kind of there shouldn't be a guillotine, why kind of the time should be extended. So there is a bit of debate, but even beyond that, kind of people can make submissions to me, say from my party, we want this piece of legislation coming up or whatever. So I go in armed with kind of the reasoning. So it's not just kind of here's a document, that's what's happening. And also then you have the following day or the following week, each day we have the order of business, so the Parliament itself votes on what the business is. And quite often there is votes kind of rejecting what's presented, or sometimes kind of there is an argument and the government will accede to the demand for additional time or whatever. So in fact the TDs have a say in ordering their own business. I agree with Michelle, it's a bit bizarre having your order of business kind of after business already done. The standing orders also set out key parts of our timetable. They're set in standing order so that questions to the Minister is set at this time, questions to the Taoiseach, leaders' questions, they're already scheduled. It's not the only business that is ordered beyond that is the legislative business. Everything else is nearly set in stone, kind of the time and the allocation of time for it. So it's really only how much time and when we allocate time to a certain piece of legislation.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful, I think. Finbar, did you want to intervene? No, you didn't. No, sorry. So, Charlie, and we'll have to we will have to guillotine this discussion shortly.
I think, Chair, it's entirely appropriate in terms of Dáil reform that the members should have an input and should, in effect, set the agenda. Concern is expressed that if that happens, that a programme for government might in some way be frustrated. That won't happen, because membership of the committee, by definition, will have a government majority in any event. So it's not frustrating the programme for government, but it's actually ensuring that Parliament is exercising its own constitutional role.
But I think it is useful for members to know that already you have a system in place, the whip system, which by and large works, as Angus has said, and is not a complete diktat from government. There's a bit of give and take, and I mean, I've seen the way in the last year, the way that you know, at a very practical level behind the scenes, politicians can work very well together. Art, do you want to respond from?
A couple of points, maybe if I take them in order. Robert's point in relation to urgent legislation, etc. Of course, there would have to be a get-out clause, and I think that would be the detail of the mechanism one way or another. In the same way as the recent heads of bill legislation, which says, well, the heads of bill must be sent to a committee in advance of publication. There's a savour in that saying, well, if it can't happen, then the Minister must provide an explanation to the Dáil as to why it can't happen for urgency or other reasons. So I'd imagine that the same thing would happen in this case. Catherine's point in relation to power, all we're talking about here, Catherine, is the power to set the agenda, not the way that the actual business itself, the content carries on the same way. All we're talking here about is discussing how we set the agenda, how much time we spend on various issues, not the way the Dáil does its business itself. Francis' point in relation to the government programme for government. I mean, Charlie made a point that, well, if it was a committee, then the government would have a majority in this committee. In some parliaments, they have a business committee with representatives of each of the parliaments, so everybody has an equal say. But always, the Dáil itself sets its own agenda. So what we're doing here is a business committee brings a proposal to say, we've had a look at this and this is what we propose to the House. Ultimately, the government have a majority and they get to either agree or disagree with that proposal as well. So all you're doing is changing the dynamic in the way that the agenda is put to the House. That's all that's proposed. I've no difficulty putting the secret ballot into the constitutional part as part of question 5, if that's the wishes of the membership. If you'd like to answer that question, that's fine.
But I mean, the point was made, I think, earlier on that, in fact, there is some question as to whether this requires constitutional change or not. It could well be that. Is that right, Leah?
But I think Angs's point was that it's the permanence of this issue. That it shouldn't be at the whim. So we put in standing orders so the government can change it the next time, etc. If you put in the Leah, you want to?
Exactly. I mean, arguably it's required by the Constitution, but even if it isn't, it might well be desirable to put it in the Constitution anyway to copper fasten it, as Angus said.
Yeah. Although there might be other views that it's adequate to leave it in standing orders.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean, should we not?
We can put it in both. To be honest, we can put it in both,
right.
and members can express a view.
All right.
Where they'd like
fine.
to see it.
And that's the best solution. Okay. Could we move on to committees, Art?
Very good. Thank you. Committees. There were, as David mentioned, there was a lot of feedback yesterday in relation to improvements that were suggested for committees. One is the way that committee chairs, the number of opposition committee chairs, and that the way that they are elected. Proportionate allocation of committee chairs simply means that you would get, and each party would get a number of committee chairs based on their strength in the Dáil, and that would be allocated in a much more formal way than it is right now, where it's done sometimes by consensus or certainly by discussion, but ultimately it's up to the government to concede committee chairs as opposed to there being a hard and fast rule. I know there is a proposal from the government currently that in future that committee chairs will be allocated using the D'Hondt method, and that's simply, Alban would know all about that. It's simply basically a proportional distribution of chairs, and then once you agree on the number of chairs for each parties, then there will be a secret ballot to elect them, and if people think that's a good idea, then work away. More technical and professional resources to committees. I think this is an issue. If you want committees to do all the things that you'd like them to do, obviously it's very important that they have the resources to be able to do this, because ultimately, and we didn't really touch on it yesterday, is that although Jerry Buttimer did raise it at one point when he spoke about one of his days, I mean, capacity for Oireachtas members is huge, you know, and Oireachtas members simply don't have all the time to read all the papers and to do all the work that's necessary to work in committees and be in the plenary and look after their constituents and do all the things they have to do. So resourcing is a key issue here. We need to be able to generate capacity for Oireachtas members, for them to deliver all the things that people expect them to do. That capacity simply doesn't exist right now. So maybe resources could be the solution to that particular problem. The Dáil Reform Committee, this came from John Bruton yesterday. He suggested that the whips are the last people who should be proposing Dáil reform, and that we should have former members, external individuals chaired by the Ceann Comhairle to look at the issue of Dáil reform and to bring forward proposals. But ultimately, again, it's a bit like the Business Committee. It would only be proposals. Under Article 1510 of the Constitution, the Dáil gets to set its own rules and procedures. So how proposals get on the floor of the House is what we're talking about. It's a simple mechanism. The working group of committee chairs is a bit like the liaison committee that Meg Russell spoke about yesterday in the House of Commons. It's a group of committee chairs of each committee. They get together in a forum. Currently, right now, they look at administrative issues, the way they allocate budgets, and occasionally how they bring proposals to the House, but creating a much more formal role for them where they call in the Taoiseach and talk about the whole of government approach to life and being a little more strategic. So that was a suggestion yesterday. And another one was a committee week every month, so that members would be able to focus their energies entirely on committees, and that the Dáil wouldn't sit for 1 week every month. Now, that always sounds great to me. We did this back in the 90s, and as Noel Dempsey mentioned yesterday, that the members didn't like it, and sometimes the opposition ultimately didn't like it, because when the Dáil's not sitting, then there's no leaders' questions, there's no parliamentary questions, there are no debates, etc., and it's all done in committees as well. So the downside of that always is that the Dáil sits less, and up to now, over the years, people's ideas of Dáil reform was all about the Dáil sitting more days and sitting more hours. And now that the Dáil is sitting 50% more time than it did 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, that doesn't seem to have been the solution to the problem that you seem to indicate what it is. So maybe it's not about the number of days and the number of hours. It's because if you're doing things the wrong way, spending twice as much time doing it isn't the solution. So maybe that's an issue. So it's just something to bear in mind.
Would it be useful for Mary to, again, talk out a bit implications as you see them, Mary?
Yeah, sure. The first proportionate allocation of committee chairs and secret ballot for their election, I mean, it goes back to the previous point about the secret ballot for the Ceann Comhairle. It's essentially the same argument. Currently, the PAC is the most high-profile Dáil committee. It's led by an opposition chair. We have the opposition in the chair there. And it's a powerful committee as well, so you would potentially be broadening that arrangement. Is that obstructive or is that constructive is the question to be posed here. And, it's potentially both. So again, we must always go back to balance and trying to ensure that there is balance in these arrangements. And being aware that there are often unintended consequences when we, again, promote a proposal which is well-intentioned and well-argued, but it can often be very difficult to foresee how that plays out in practice. So I guess that's just a word of caution. On the issue of resources to the committees, I mean, yes.
Good balance there.
Yeah. But however, that's an investment. And is this institution, are these structures worth that investment? Because it's an investment of time, but it's also an investment of money. And for politicians to spend money, that can be a dangerous business if they're spending it on themselves. So, let's be reasonable. But absolutely, TDs are extraordinarily busy people, and they don't get the time and the space to. They really don't get the time and space that they probably need to consider some of these issues in the depth that might be necessary. So helping them to get to a point where they have that level of understanding, I certainly would be in favour. But it is an investment and it does cost money, and that should be part of the consideration. Because you know what will happen. TDs spending hundreds of thousands or a couple of million, and meanwhile people are waiting on beds in hospital corridors. So anyway, Dáil Reform Committee should include external members and former TDs. Again, there is nothing inoffensive about this, and I think there is wisdom in this particular approach. And I'm not giving you an enormous amount of balance, but allowing the whips to dominate the Dáil Reform agenda doesn't lend a great degree of diversity to that particular process. So broadening the input, whether it's from within the chamber or outside of the chamber, I think is certainly something which has merit. The working group of committee chairs should be given the power to call the Taoiseach. Again, on paper, this looks like a very commendable provision, but again, how would that work in practice? And I suppose the fear would be that it might turn into something of a PR stunt. It should be well-intentioned in the event that the Taoiseach is being called to give account. And it should be constructive. And I suppose, again, we might harbour some concerns about whether that would be the approach that would be adopted. In the event that you can get the Taoiseach to a working group, the media will turn up. And it needs to be used, that opportunity should be used constructively, and can that be guaranteed? Having a committee week each month in the Dáil, this is something which is quite common in other legislatures. There is a dedicated committee week where the main house does not meet. And I think many TDs, certainly the TDs that I've engaged with, this has been something which has come up time and time again, and it's something they have expressed a high degree of support for, in my experience. I think the benefit of Committee Week would be that it would allow politicians the time and the space to concentrate on specific policy issues. It would allow them to develop a degree of policy expertise, which I think as citizens and voters is something that we have reasonable expectations of. I think too, if there's no theatre, if the House isn't meeting, there is no theatre. So where is the discussion found? It's found in the committee rooms. It might lend itself to greater media coverage, and it might be a good PR exercise as well for politicians. Again, that's not necessarily guaranteed. But I appreciate it didn't necessarily work in the past. I think life and politics has become increasingly complex since the 1990s. So I think maybe having a second go at this might well be worth it.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe, yeah, we'll take some questions, Thomas Byrne, but I also do, I'm very conscious that, this weekend, almost inevitably, most of the voices that we've heard have been political voices, because the politicians are much more familiar with a lot of this territory. And, I would encourage citizens, if they have anything to say or any issues to raise or questions to ask, to do so. Thomas, please.
Yeah, just two brief points. The proportional allocation of committee chairs, I'd agree with that. But I think it's worth noting that was always the case until this government came in. In fact, they were generally given out on a proportionate basis, and it's a pity that changed. Secondly, in relation to committee week, I think that's an excellent idea. But I have to say, not, in my opinion, at the expense of leaders' questions in the Dáil. I think if it's seen, the government would love to have committee week because they would put them off the hook completely. So I think that if you have a committee week, I would still like to see the normal schedule of leaders' questions or ministers' questions, which would only take up, I don't know, an hour and a half in the chamber, and the rest of the time, committee week might be actually a better balance.
Okay, thank you. Angus, please.
Thanks. Just a few points of information, not leaning one way or the other on these questions. The convention at the moment is obviously that the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, has always had an opposition chair. But also now the convention is that the Petitions Committee, the newer committee, will also be the same, both of which are non-legislative committees. And also to bear in mind, even if you had a system where you would elect chairs proportionately to their membership, there would always be a situation where you'd have a government majority, just to bear that in mind. So it's not going to change kind of substantially the way the committee votes or whatever. It just gives more opportunities to people who are elected. The second one is the committee week. I've no major problem with this, but in the past what happened, because it used to be committee weeks when the Dáil finished, there'd be a week or two, say in July or kind of before the Dáil would resume in January in the past, which usually had committee meetings. And what it ended up is often the Dublin TDs were asked to substitute because you're in there anyway, you might as well cover this committee for us as well. So to be careful of that. The other thing is that committees often have to deal with legislation and motions kind of quite quickly. So, for instance, it might be scheduled this week that a piece of legislation, a motion kind of to deal with EU business, kind of has to be passed within 2 or 3 days. So if you go for a committee week, that it shouldn't be just exclusively a committee week, that you can have committees outside of that. The other thing is a practical point, and Art would be aware of this, is there's only 4 rooms for committees, set out for committees in the Dáil. There's only a certain amount of staff allocated. And some of that staff moves and covers 2 or 3 committees. So practically, you would end up having to build more committee rooms or utilise other spaces, as the Health Committee used the Shannon because it wasn't sitting that week. So there is a practical point of view. And also, I don't believe that if you put all of the hours that the committees sit, for instance, say this week, if you put them all together, you would use up all of the time that week from 9 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock at night. There isn't enough time in a week if you're squashing it down into 1 week per month.
Okay, thanks very much for that helpful Pat, you were first and then John, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Very, very briefly, just picking up what Angus said there in relation to the committees and structures of committees, the fact is on item 2, it says more technical and professional resources to the committees. Perhaps that could be changed as well to look at more material resources to be available as well, in the sense that if they're going to have so many committees, then they should be not alone adequately resourced in terms of technical and professional ability, but also the physical space must be made available to them. I think it's important to recognise something that John Bruton said yesterday in relation to what the role of the Dáil is, that it's not alone a legislative body, but it's also a scrutinising body, but the main business itself is to ensure that legislation is passed, and that good legislation is passed. And that the committees, I think, coming from the floor of this particular weekend, it seems that the committees seem to be one of the best ways forward in guaranteeing that good legislation is prepared and enacted. The one thing that must be sold to the public as well as to TDs, as Mary rightly said, that in the past where technical committees have been set up, it has proved to be relatively unpopular to a degree. But I think it's a point that was made yesterday that the committee structure is a way for TDs to develop themselves and to actually promote their own career path that beyond the traditional career paths that are seen within the Dáil, I'd like for TDs to think of it more as kind of like a situation of continuing professional development. In a professional environment, you have to continually train, upskill, and so on. Why shouldn't the committees be seen by the TDs as being continual professional development in order to, first of all, enact good legislation, but then secondly, also ensure that the TDs themselves remain current, relevant, and, as the buzzword is, fit for purpose.
Okay,
Thank you.
much, yeah. I mean, I think there's a basic issue here that if this group or other groups are advocating that the Dáil improves the way it works through better committee systems, there is a resource issue. And, you know, you can't have all these demands for improvement without realising that is a price to be paid, and that has to be recognised by the public and by the media. John.
John Lardner. Though I appreciate not every politician has grandstanded, but to hear some, one would believe that everything is okay and there's no need for change. We're here to discuss reform, and there is genuinely a level of, quite a sizable level of dissatisfaction out there presently. So reform is required. One of the reforms I think would certainly be very helpful and proven to be so is committees, but more powerful committees. Committees who we know what they are, who's on them, and for the good work they do, that the reports are published, are discussed in the Dáil, and are implemented and reviewed. So that's just what I have to say as a citizen member.
All right. Thanks very much, John. Maureen, please.
Maureen O'Sullivan. Just following on from what Angus said, I don't think a committee week would work, excuse me, unless it was every month. Because sometimes committees need to meet more frequently. But I think the problem from being on one of the committees is that sometimes you're in the middle of a committee meeting and then a vote is called. And I always find it very disrespectful to those people who have come in to make a presentation to the committee, and some of them have travelled distances, they put a lot of work into the presentation they're going to make, and then suddenly all of the members have to leave to go to the chamber to vote, and that could be 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer to get back to the discussion, and it breaks that discussion. So I don't know if it can be included somewhere that there's a designated time for committees of at least a minimum time where they won't be interrupted.
Okay, thanks. The sequence was, Finbar, did you put your hand up, please? And then Ivana, and then Francis.
Finbar O'Brien, you just stated there a couple of minutes ago, Mr. Chairman, that there's a price to be paid for changes and things like that in the country. The country can't pay much more. They've paid more than what with the last couple of years because of all the money that's gone. Everything is spent. The country is in a mess. So changes must be made.
Okay.
And I think, like what Professor McCarthy said there a while ago, you know, when they make these changes, they could cause different repercussions. But things have happened. Changes will be no harm, I think, anyway.
Okay, thanks, Finbar. Ivana, and then Francis. And then John.
Thanks, Amy. Just coming back to Ivana Bacik, just coming back to what John said about, you know, radical change and changing, and the committees being a very positive vehicle for change, as we've seen over the course of the weekend. Our table did believe that the committees should be given constitutional status, and I think it would be good if we could reflect that in the ballot paper, that in addition to the issues we're asked to discuss about how the committees do their work under this heading, that we would also consider giving constitutional status to committees, not rerunning the referendum that's already been held, but just simply giving them a status in the Constitution, because it's come out from, as we've heard, that they're, you know, currently they're not in the Constitution. If we're going to really strengthen them, strengthen their powers and strengthen their the way in which they can hold government and to account and so on, I think that would be an important change to make. In terms of the committee week, I think there'd be huge support for that. I think in order to make it work more effectively, I think the idea that we would still have some plenary session during that week, in other words, that the Dáil would sit just perhaps for an hour a day for leaders' questions, no more than that, would get over the problem problem Maureen mentions that all of us have experienced in committees, but would still ensure that there is some plenary, and would ensure also that more than just the Dublin TDs are there for the committee week. And just finally, it came up a lot yesterday, and I'd just like to see it reflected on the ballot paper, perhaps not under this heading, the issue of family-friendly or gender-friendly parliament procedures. I mean, if we're talking about radical change, the Dáil is 84% male, and it's always been at least 84% male. Hopefully we will see more women coming in as a result of the new legislation on gender quotas from the next election, but we do need to look very seriously at reforming parliamentary practice to make it a more attractive place, not just for women, but for anyone with young families or with caring commitments. And I think it'd be good to see that on the ballot paper.
All right, thanks, Amanda. Francis, please. And then John, I think we'll have to finish this discussion after these two contributions.
Well, just to say that I think the various recommendations here, would strengthen committees. But I do want to make the point, and it is in no way to say that reform isn't needed. Of course reform is needed, and we have to continually reform and develop. But I do want to make the point, we've had committees in Dáil Éireann for a long time now. Art might tell me how many years. But it's this question of how do you inform people and how do you capture the work that is actually going on at the moment? Because if you take the Justice Committee at the moment, the Justice Committee meets twice a week. They've had hearings from all sorts of groups that they've examined legislation. I'm not on that committee now, I'm just mentioning it. They've had groups in to discuss a whole, the reform of, various criminal justice pieces of legislation, etc., etc., etc. So there is a huge amount of committee work going on, and I think in a way we're doing a disservice to the amount of committee work that's actually happening already. And the question is, if it was really successful, what would it look like? And how would people know about it? So that's kind of another element to this discussion that I think we really need to tease out a bit, because the committees are, many TDs I think would say the committees are working very well. They're informing government, they're changing legislation, they're highlighting issues. You see it probably on television and communication around the PAC more than anything else, but all of the other committees are doing similar type work. So there is an issue about, one of the members of the convention here said yesterday, we do a lousy job of selling what we're doing. And it's very often only the adversarial work gets reported, or high conflict. So if the committees, I want to ask the panel, if the committees were working effectively, a lot of it is behind the scenes at present, what would your criteria of success be around the committees? Would it be the public knowing more about it? What would you see? Because I believe there's an awful lot of undocumented work from a public point of view going on at present, and a lot of impact from the committees on ministers, on legislation. So I think that's an important element of what we're discussing here today.
And I do think that in the report that we write reflecting this weekend, we need to give some sense of precisely that point, that there is what is the starting reality at the moment. John, at the back there, please. Microphone, please,
Dundrum. I find the first part of this very difficult to understand. I can understand proportionate allocation of committee chairs. I suppose a more important aspect is the prestigiousness of the committee that one serves on, and how they would be allocated between government and others. And then, how do you go ahead and have a secret ballot on it? Will all backbenchers have a say in who gets onto the committee? So you could end up with a committee where you'd have, say, a chairman who would be surrounded then by all members of the government on the committee. It doesn't appear to hold together as a unit. I can't see how you can have a proportionate allocation of committee chairs and a secret ballot for their election.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to take two last comments, because we really are running out of time now. I really want to get to the point where we can sign off on this ballot paper and begin to listen to our colleagues from way back. Jerry, you were first, and then Mary. Yeah.
Jerry Bortman, Chairman. Could I just make the point? I would agree with Thomas that I think you need to have leaders' questions if you're going to have a committee week. So I would support that suggestion. Angus is right. There are only 4 committee rooms in Leinster House, and if you use the Shannon chamber, that gives you 5. So that does, and the Dáil chamber 6. Okay, so that does give you. Okay, yeah, sorry, 6. Yeah, 6 rooms. That gives you. And you're 16 committees, so that does give you a question but
well, there's Mondays and Fridays and Tuesday mornings as well.
Okay.
You would change
Yeah, okay.
entirely the way you structure the
Okay,
business.
that's fine.
There is time, there is capacity.
And,
all right.
and I would support, Chairman, that you would, and I would be in favour, as a suggestion, of having a committee week, but you would also have committees sitting in the non-committee week as well.
Okay.
Okay, and then, can I just I want to just ask this question, because I'm a small bit confused myself, and maybe it's a testimony to myself. John says we need reform, and that seems to be a great word in the last election, was reform. But if we say reform is necessary, then the ballot paper that we have in front of us, to me, I pose a question to the panel. How does the reform agenda how is it encaptured in this ballot paper? For example, how does the reform assist in, if you take a job of Parliament to scrutinise the government or to scrutinise the agencies, i.e. the Central Bank or the HSE or the National Transport Authority, and if you take the regulators, who we can all, in terms of a portion or whatever, how does the reform that we're proposing today assist Parliament in holding these people to account? I don't see it contained here. And in terms of scrutiny of government and the agencies under their control. So how do we bring them more accountable to Parliament through the reform we're putting here?
Okay.
Come on.
I think that's getting into very wide issues, which I'm not sure we can deal with. But Mary, and then we're going to go back to Art and maybe Leah for it.
Okay, Sheila Cameron.
Sheila.
My question was just further to what Francis was saying about the committees currently doing lots of good work. Is there any structure whereby the committee reports and recommendations go back to the Dáil and are discussed and adopted, or otherwise?
Okay, we'll get to, yeah. Art, would you comment on all of any comments you make? But can we get agreement on these questions, or if not, some amendment version? Okay.
Okay, I'll touch on some of the highlights, maybe. Thomas's question about the proportion of chairs. There are 3 opposition chairs at the moment. In the last Dáil, there were 6. The size of the majority, it's exactly the same, almost exactly the same in this Dáil as was the last time. I suppose the issue is in relation to the committees themselves. It's the choice of committee more than anything else. There's Public Accounts Committee, the Petitions Committee, and the Members' Interests Committee. They're the ones chaired by the opposition at the moment. Using D'Hondt, the opposition would get a greater choice of the selection of committees. That's an issue. I will amend the ballot paper to include a proposal that there will be leaders' questions. There's no issue with that. There's no problem putting in a question on the constitutional change, a reference to a status for committees. I'll include a family-friendly hours if people would like to vote on that. The question of committee rooms. Right now, committee rooms are used from Tuesday afternoon to Thursday morning. So it's half of the week is that they're not currently utilised because members generally are around when the Dáil is sitting. If you're restructured, you would be going from early Friday morning to late on Friday evening, and you'd have the Dáil in the Shannon Chamber. We did the mechanics on this before. It's possible to manage your business, to cater for everybody. The communications issue is huge, Francis. We've had problems with this for years. And even with the new communication strategy, we've appointed some committees, press officers. Sometimes, I hate blaming the media for things as well, is that some of the work that committees do, particularly scrutiny, the heavy lifting, the 2 meetings a week, is mind-numbingly monotonous. And it's not sexy and it's not newsworthy, so people tend not to pay any attention to it. So we do have a difficulty translating, and I would be reluctant to use the word sexing up the work that people do, because that has other connotations from a hero of mine. But we do need to find a way of explaining the way that committees do their work in a way that is attractive to the public. And that eludes us right now, but it's certainly some very fine minds working on that particular issue.
Okay.
Leah, do you think much to talk about?
Yeah, and just to add very briefly, just in response to Jerry's point there, I mean, we could put in one extra thing to vote on here in relation to perhaps reviewing the accountability of agencies to the Oireachtas, or reviewing standing orders in that regard. A lot of the provisions are in legislation. It's a real big issue, though. So
these are set in the committee's terms of reference. I mean, it's already
exactly.
catered for quite explicitly. And the committees have an awful lot of powers right now, and it's not necessarily all about giving committees more powers. It's generating the capacity for committees to do that work. Okay. Committees have the power to hold agencies to account, to look at their strategy statements, to bring the CEOs to talk about their accounts, to do all of these things. It's finding the time. and creating the capacity. That's the problem. It's not always about powers. So I think putting in something to give them more powers, it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea because they already have that power. They just need to choose to use it.
Okay. Could I suggest that the Convention might accept Art's suggestions, some amendments to the set of questions, but by and large the set of questions about the committees is accepted. Great. Thanks. Could we move on to could you explain? Could you explain the rest of the?
Just brief, 30 seconds, then Leah.
No, I just wanted to go ahead to consider the rest of the ballot paper.
Yeah, no,
exactly.
we're saying 30 seconds. If
there's nothing before we consider that. Yeah.
Okay, with just the whip, very briefly. We explained yesterday, a whip is a person whose job is to encourage members of the party to vote in the way that the party wishes. There has been a recent example in Sean's party where in the abortion legislation that stricture was relaxed and the Fianna Fáil party allowed a free vote on the issue of the abortion. So the members of the party were allowed to vote according to their conscience, according to their own wishes. There seems to be a feeling within the room that the whip is too restrictive and it doesn't allow for proper debate on issues as well. So we'll reflect it in the content of the report that if people would like to recommend a relaxation of the whip in certain circumstances, that's what it means by a free vote. The question 4, I suppose, is the only one that we need to deal with, and maybe Leah, you'd like to take that?
Yeah.
This is arising from Angus's proposal yesterday about opposition parties being able to bring in proposals that involve a charge on the people.
Okay, great. Just if we could consider question 4 there together with the later question there, which refers to amending Article 17.2 of the Constitution. They're linked together, and I've been given the unenviable task of trying to explain this complex issue to you in a minute or two. Okay, Article 17.2 of the Constitution, which was shown on the slide earlier, effectively means that you can't, have a Dáil vote on a proposal which would involve a charge on public monies. That means, in other words, which would use up state revenues. And that's kind of the general rule there, unless you have a money message from the government, which means that the government effectively gives prior approval to that expenditure. So that's what Article 17.2 says, and the reasons for that are pragmatic and so on, as has been explained yesterday, because otherwise a lot of parliamentary time would be used up debating legislative and other measures which the country just simply could not afford and which the money would never be approved for. Now, the issue is that Article 17.2, when it's implemented in standing orders, as Angus pointed out yesterday, the standing orders actually go a lot further than is necessary. So as well as implementing that money message rule, by saying that you can't proceed to the committee stage of a bill unless you have that money message from the government, where the bill will involve a charge on public funds. The standing orders also say, Standing Order 156, say that where a bill is being proposed which would involve a charge on public funds, except where that charge is merely incidental, then only a member of government can propose that bill. So, as Angus was saying, an opposition member can't propose that bill. But again, as John Bruton was saying yesterday, that's a pragmatic rule which again avoids wasting time, and it's kind of within the spirit of Article 17.2. But furthermore, just 2 more things I want to say. Standing Order 156 goes further again, and it says that where there's a committee stage of a bill which would involve a charge on public funds, that amendments cannot basically be proposed by members other than a member of the government. So that is the restriction Angus was mentioning yesterday. And as we were saying yesterday, there is some scope for manoeuvre there. For example, you could create a new procedural device in standing orders whereby, say, an opposition deputy could maybe make a recommendation just for debate in the committee. It wouldn't be voted on, but he could raise a proposal at committee stage of a bill. He could suggest it maybe to the government, and there could be some sort of device created there. So what we're saying there is some changes to standing orders would be possible to sort of relax this rule a little bit without changing the Constitution. A further point I have to make, and this is the final one of this, is that the standing orders also go one step further, because Standing Order 155 extends all of those rules from Article 17.2 to situations involving taxation. So it uses the phrase "a charge upon the people," which means, for example, if you had a wealth tax or something, and that means that only government members can propose those kind of bills, and so on and so forth. So all those restrictions are there. So opposition members wouldn't be able to propose bills involving taxation of the people as such, to bring money into the state. So really the issues there are, do you want to maybe consider suggesting changes to the standing orders to make the rules more relaxed there within the Constitution, or on the other hand, do you want to have a suggestion on the ballot paper also that you would amend Article 17.2 of the Constitution? I'm not sure if there's much support for that, but that's an option, okay?
Okay,
Yeah.
in essence, a lot of this is very technical. In essence, I think the proposal is, right now, the opposition members aren't allowed to bring forward any proposals that cost any money. So they can't even raise them. So if you want to allow the opposition the power to bring forward proposals for new taxation or spending money, etc., then vote yes. And if you think it'd be a waste of time, then vote no. It's as simple as that.
Okay, Francis, we are really tight for time now, and I'm very conscious of our responsibility to our colleagues from away path. So could we be very brief?
Yeah, just to make the very obvious point in relation to a government's budgetary strategy and the potential of this recommendation, I think that people need to be very clear about it. It effectively means that for every piece of legislation, you could have an opposition amendment suggesting that you spend money. That's the effect of it. And I think it's going to be very tempting, I have to say, for opposition to be suggesting that we spend more money. And obviously that has to be balanced, with the government's budgetary strategy. So it is a recommendation. Again, I would like more information on it. I would like to know how this works in other parliaments. I think they said the House of Commons has something similar. So in terms of the broadness of the recommendation, I just am pointing out that I would have a concern about it in terms of, a government's budgetary strategy, and it may be that members of the panels could have some response to that. It would be useful, I think, for members to be fully informed about, what we would be voting for here.
Potentially, this issue, this is an issue where it is complex, and, my sense is that a lot of people probably feel they don't understand it sufficiently, or the consequences of it, but let's see anyway. Let's get a few more comments. Angus, and then Thomas, and then Avril, please.
I'll be brief on this, just because I was one of the ones who raised it after John Bruton mentioned it yesterday. Meg said yesterday that the House of Commons looked at this and they saw it as an anti-democratic measure. And we need to be careful. We're not suggesting that the opposition can pass any of this legislation. At the end of the day, the government has a majority, so it can. But what it does, in the way it's implemented at the moment, it would prevent, for instance, if we wanted to change, say, for instance, the universal social charge to be set in different ways, it would prevent the opposition suggesting kind of that those, say, for instance, on 150,000 would kind of be charged at a greater level than those at kind of 50,000. It just restricts that debate. Kind of, in the end of the day, people need to remember the government has a majority, and if you need to restrict the time, as in kind of that it's a waste of time, you could use the same argument that everything that the opposition put forward could be a waste of time in some ways because the government has a majority and they can determine. It's just about debate, and at the very least, we should be looking at lifting the standing orders in the way that they interpret the Constitution. My preference is that the Constitution would be changed to allow us to publish legislation. So, for instance, my colleague Pearse Doherty has published legislation on the wealth tax, but it's not published in the Dáil because the Dáil won't facilitate it because the Constitution says that you cannot produce such legislation.
Okay. I'm going to have to be very, very strict in terms of people's contribution. I want any point you make, could you make it very quickly? Thomas, then Avril, and then Deirdre. And Katrina. Sorry.
Yeah, briefly, this is one of the most frustrating parts of being in opposition and putting amendments forward, like when this excuse is used. We have already a procedure in the Seanad for finance bills, because the Seanad doesn't have power over money in the state, and the procedure is that we make recommendations, and that was mentioned yesterday. So, that procedure is already there, and if something is going to cost money, then maybe instead of calling it an amendment, call it a recommendation, and at least allow a debate on it, because it's really stifling debate at the moment. Almost everything now could cost €1, and then the opposition aren't allowed to put it forward, and that's how it operates in practice, and we've no right of appeal whatsoever.
Okay. Thank you. Avril.
Thanks.
Personally, I agree with Thomas and Angus. The current system, as it works, is profoundly anti-democratic. It's the reason why, when legislation like the property tax, the water charges came before the House, most of the amendments that were put down by the opposition weren't even debated because they would have cost an extra euro. Because if you're suggesting, if a bill comes forward with 100 different charges in it, you pick out one charge and object to it and say either you want to put in an amendment saying remove that part of the bill or put in a slightly lower charge, that amendment can't even be discussed. And I think all we're asking here is that there will be a debate. As has already been pointed out, the government has an inherent majority, but let's not end up with another situation after you pass flawed legislation with amendments that couldn't even be debated, and then you end up 2 months later with people going, God, is that what was in that bill? And that this, of all the procedures in Leinster House, to me, is the most objectionable for exactly that reason. It closes down debate on really important legislation rather than at least making sure that things are actually discussed.
Okay, thank you. Deirdre.
Hi, Deirdre Donaghy. I just think this is a hugely complex issue that we could spend an entire weekend talking about, and we didn't really have much in the way of debate. So in terms of something to vote on, could we maybe make it a recommendation that this is something we think should be looked into by a committee or something, rather than asking people to express a yes/no vote on it?
Okay, thank you. Katrina first, and then Ivana. And then we're going to close it. Okay.
I think we should be voting on it because I think this is fundamentally it's part of a democratic system. France has asked what happens in other jurisdictions. In the north, committees can bring forward amendments. Individual MLAs can bring forward amendments. If you want committees to have more power and more prestige, and you know they're doing all this work, yet they can't even bring forward amendments, or excuses are used to close them down. I think this is very, very important because that's where some of the good debate can happen. And I don't think we should defer it because John or someone made a point about let's have real reform. If you want some real reform, and this is only minor real reform, I think it does need to be on the ballot paper today.
Okay, thank you. Ivana.
Ivana Bacik, just very briefly, coming back to what Jerry said earlier about real reform, and I'm struck that we need to put on the ballot paper, I think, also following what Deirdre said, something that Meg Russell suggested yesterday, that the Dáil Reform Committee, not only should it include external members and former TDs and so on, but this convention should be asked whether we want to recommend that a Dáil Reform Committee would investigate and examine proposals for real reform of the Dáil, including things like, the power of opposition to debate, to put forward amendments on financial matters. I mean, I think what we need from this convention is to see a process put in place for where detailed technical reforms can be debated and scrutinised and recommended by committees, as we saw in Westminster, which have made real differences and really democratised the workings of the Parliament there. And I think it would be a shame if we don't, on the ballot paper, say something about what we would like a Dáil Reform Committee to do into the future.
Okay, Art, do you want to make some
comment?
comment?
Two quick points. I mean, if people want to do that, I can certainly include a question around a Dáil Reform Committee doing real reform. The other issue, I mean, and it's in an effort to be helpful, because the suggestion about the proposal came from the floor yesterday, came from the tables during discussions, and John Bruton raised it on the device to allow the opposition to put forward amendments. Taking into account Deirdre's suggestion, maybe we could put yes, no, or defer. I mean, put three choices in, give people the opportunity to either, get somebody else to have a look at it at a future point, and we can reflect that in the body of the report. If people were minded to do that, I'm happy to do that.
I mean, that's a suggestion to try and, if you like, in a sense, get us to a point where we can finally agree a ballot paper. We're already 20 minutes over our time on this matter. My concern about voting on matters that people actually don't understand the consequences of is something that I would be slightly concerned about. Can I take it? I mean, as we've gone through this, Art has made some suggestions about how the current draft of the ballot paper might be amended. Can I take it? This is an imperfect science, but can I take it that the convention agrees with what he has heard and will be then reflected in a revised ballot paper?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just make one small point? That you'll get two ballot papers now because it is lengthened. So we'll make one changes to standing orders and the other is constitutional change.
Okay.
So one will be pink and one will be yellow, but vote on both. Yeah.
All right. Fiach, well, I would, yeah, I would, No, it's not. I know you try to be constructive.
Just on a philosophical level, Fiach Machanil. I mean, and I'm just picking up what Ivana says. The strong message this weekend, right, is that, is that the convention feels that the Dáil itself should reform itself along a whole series of broad principles which we've heard across all the tables there. So if nothing else, I think we're micromanaging a lot of detail here, and we're trying to get involved in housekeeping, and that's, I think, a shame on the Oireachtas that actually the convention has to spend this amount of time to do that. I think there's a strong message to government and a strong message to ourselves and the Oireachtas is that get your house in order. We've given you lots of details here, but actually, I think a recommendation to establish a Dáil Reform Committee that has a kind of a broad appeal and a broad kind of representation should get their house in order, and I think they have 2 years to do it.
Okay. Brona, I think you have the last word, actually, yeah.
Yeah, very briefly, where all the points that have been raised are extremely important, one thing that was brought up and discussed by a lot of people that I spoke with, reform is extremely important, but there's nothing in the ballot that's mentioned about accountability for bad decisions made or bad judgments. People should be held accountable, and I think that's the biggest reform. Mm-hmm. That if you feel that your government can be held to account for decisions that have been made and suggestions that have been ignored, advice that's been ignored, then people would have more support for them.
All right, thank you. I just wonder whether we need to break now because the practical business of getting the ballot paper revised and translated, etc., it has to be done. We were scheduled to go directly on to our WAPA colleagues. It might be better to very quickly, and I mean very quickly, equip yourself with coffee, and then we'll move directly on to our WAPA colleagues. Thank you.